Hello, welcome to Have Your Say. I'm Robin Lustig in Jerusalem. There are few more controversial politicians in this part of the world than the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. But after he suffered a stroke last Wednesday, it's not thought likely that he'll be able to continue in office. So what does that mean for Israel and for the Middle East? He's been a leading politician for the past 3 decades, a soldier for nearly 3 decades before that. Israelis and Palestinians are now anxiously waiting to see what effect his illness will have on their lives. This is your chance to have your say.
You can phone Have Your Say on 442087495353 or email us. The address is haveyoursay@bbc.co.uk. You can also send an SMS text message to 447736 100 100. All of those details and information on other ways to get in touch are on our website, bbcnews.com/haveyoursay.
Well, your emails are already flooding in. We've had this one from Ashraf Al-Dada in St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. He says, I'm truly saddened by Mr. Sharon's medical situation. He is a father figure and a protector of the State of Israel. David Alon writes from Haifa here in Israel to say, even if Sharon recovers, he won't be Prime Minister. The feeling now is similar to the feeling after Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. We have no leader. Well, joining me here in Jerusalem is Professor Gerald Steinberg from Bar Ilan University. Professor Steinberg, thank you very much for coming on to the programme. Do you agree with what David said from Haifa, that Israel has no leader now?
I think his response is emotional, and many Israelis have that sense that there's a real vacuum and will miss having Mr. Sharon, even if they were opposed to him. But just as Israel very quickly had a leader after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, Israel has Deputy Prime Minister Olmert acting as Prime Minister with all the powers. We have a government, we have elections in 78 days. The process is much stronger than any individual. So in no sense is Israel without a leader or rudderless at this stage.
OK, well, let's take our first call now, which comes from Tel Aviv, here in Israel, down on the coast. Dave Cohen is on the line. Hello, Dave.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Now, what are your thoughts as Mr. Sharon lies in hospital here in Jerusalem, critically ill? Do you feel that Israel has no leader?
Well, firstly, obviously, I'm very saddened by the situation. I do think we do have a leader problem. The professor just said now that we had a leader after Rabin. Well, we had 2 pretty bad ones, and eventually we brought in Sharon, and we were very pleasantly surprised by what we had. He is looked on like a grandfather figure. I would like to say that if people outside are actually trying to comprehend how Israelis are feeling, we do look on him pretty much like a Churchill figure. And there are many similarities between the two. And we feel very much like England would have felt had something happened to Churchill in the early stages of World War II. That's basically what's going on.
Dave, if indeed he does not return to office, and everybody here that I've spoken to assumes that he won't return to office, what impact do you think that's going to have on Israel?
Well, we used to traumas here, and it's another one. We were pleasantly surprised by Sharon. I think he surprised a lot of people, not just in Israel, but worldwide. Obviously, it's a very strong democracy, and it will carry on, and it will survive. And we are acting on an emotional down point at the moment. But having said that, he will be a very, very difficult leader to replace.
On the line from London is Issam Abu Roza. Issam, what are your thoughts about Mr. Sharon as he lies ill in hospital?
Well, I must be honest with you. I don't think as Palestinians we are going to miss Ariel Sharon. To us, Ariel Sharon is a criminal, a murderer, and he's certainly no man of peace. What we have seen under Ariel Sharon in the last few years is an attempt to impose an Israeli-dictated settlement on the Palestinians. Sharon is not interested in real peace with the Palestinians. He is not interested in talking to the Palestinians. He is only interested in unilateral steps that satisfy his own agenda. Therefore,
do you give him no credit? Do you give him, sorry to interrupt you, but I was just wondering, do you give him no credit for having pulled settlers and soldiers out of Gaza?
No, because we all know that the reason for pulling the settlers out of Gaza was to consolidate his grip on the West Bank. Gaza represented no strategic or political significance to Israel. Therefore, it was seen more of a burden. We have to remember that in 1979, Menachem Begin offered Gaza back to Sadat during the Camp David negotiations, and the Egyptians turned it down. So, therefore, Sharon has been able to pull the wool over the rest of the world by selling the Gaza unilateral withdrawal as a huge step towards peace. In fact, it was nothing like that.
Issam, thank you very much for that. Let's hear now from a caller here in Israel, Shimon Klein, on the line from Bet Hefer. Shimon, what difference do you think it's going to make to the future of your country if Mr. Sharon is unable to return to his job?
Well, first of all, I don't think that in the long run it's going to make all that difference. I think that Sharon's legacy will still continue, and I do believe that much depends on his successor. In this particular case, at the moment, it's Ehud Olmert, who will probably carry out Ariel Sharon's policies, but much remains to be seen whether he will be able to carry it out to the full. Because
Shimon, you talk about. Sorry to interrupt you, but you talk about Mr. Sharon's legacy. What do you take that legacy to be?
Well, I take it. I had lots of differences with Mr. Sharon in the past. I mean, I never ever supported him in any of the elections because of his right-wing policies. I don't hold those views, but I do give him credit for the disengagement from Gaza, which I think was a great thing, considering the opposition they had from his party. You know, I do think that that's definitely a very, very big step in the direction of disengagement, of getting towards a Palestinian state. The only unfortunate...
All right, Shimon, let's leave it there, Shimon. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we do have an awful lot of people who want to talk to us on the programme. Thanks for that. I want to go now to the hospital where Mr. Sharon is being treated. He's been there, of course, since he was rushed by ambulance from his ranch in the south of the country last Wednesday evening. A lot of Israelis have been gathering at the hospital to offer their support and, in many cases, their prayers. Our correspondent Richard Galpin is there. We can join him now. Richard, just paint a picture for us. What is the scene there at the moment?
Well, obviously, we've just had this latest bulletin from the director of the hospital here saying that there has been a slight improvement in Mr. Sharon's condition. But critically, what he's announced is that tomorrow morning, Monday morning, they do plan to try and lift him out of this medically induced coma, which he's been in for the past 4 days, ever since he suffered the stroke. And this is going to be the moment of truth, which everyone is going to be looking at to see exactly what happens, whether they do succeed in lifting him out of the coma and effectively waking him up. And then if they do manage to do that, carrying out these vital tests for the first time, their first opportunity to be able to work out what, if any, permanent damage this massive stroke and the hours and hours of brain surgery which he's had to undergo because of the hemorrhaging in his brain, if there has been permanent damage or not, and obviously what that damage is there brain damage or is there going to be paralysis, and therefore, is he going to be able to function again and go back into politics or not?
Richard, I know there are huge numbers of reporters and television crews up there. I was up there myself last night, indeed. But are there ordinary Israelis as well coming just because they want to be close to where the Prime Minister is?
Yeah, there's been a lot of people coming. I've been here since Wednesday night when he first had the stroke, and there's been a pretty steady stream of people coming here from all walks of life and basically wanting to obviously wish him very well. And I think that amongst the vast bulk of the population, there is obviously enormous concern, and they are hoping and praying that he will make a recovery. Obviously, there are people on the extremes, the extreme right, for example, who will never forgive him for withdrawing from the Gaza Strip last August. But I think, the vast bulk, majority of the population do wish he makes a speedy recovery.
All right, Richard, thanks very much indeed for that. Our correspondent Richard Galpin, who's at the Hadassah Hospital here in Jerusalem. Let me just read you a couple of emails that have just come in. Amit in Los Angeles in America. Sharon has protected his people and country from those who are intent on negating its existence. Tom in the UK. The peace process should now speed up. Sharon never wanted peace as it meant he would have been out of a job. Jack in Chelmsford in England. His death will make no difference. He hasn't died, I should say. The only person who matters is the US president and how much power he has over the Jewish lobby. Let me turn back to Professor Steinberg here with me in our Jerusalem studio. I want to pick up what Issam, the Palestinian caller from London, said. He gave Sharon no credit at all as a Palestinian for having withdrawn from Gaza because he said all he wants to do is consolidate his position, Israel's position in the West Bank. That's a widely held position among Palestinians, isn't it?
It is, and that's a big part of the problem. That's why peace does not look like it's going to happen in the next few years and perhaps a longer period as well. It's still a zero-sum perspective. And Issam's point was very personalized. This is not about Sharon. It's about Israel. It's about the Arab-Israeli conflict that goes back 75 years. And it's going to be hard to sort out how much of the policies we've seen the last 5 years have been Mr. Sharon's and how much have been the Israeli consensus pushing up from the bottom. I think Sharon's great contribution was he found a point in the middle. He was able to understand what the Israeli public really wanted, and we heard that from a couple of Israelis, wanted to get out because there was no peace process. There was not going to be a two-state solution. We learned that after the failure of Camp David and Oslo, but also did not want to maintain the status quo for Israel's interest. It helps the Palestinians, it helps the Israelis. That's not a grand peace process, and that's the way Sharon maneuvered the time that he was in office.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear now from a country which Mr. Sharon was deeply involved in at one time, Lebanon. Our next caller is Walid Nasrallah, who is in the capital, Beirut. Walid, what difference, if any, do you think it will make to your country, to the region as a whole, if Mr. Sharon does not resume as Prime Minister of Israel?
I don't see much of a difference being made, really, one way or the other. I mean, it was only a few days ago that the Emir of Dubai died, and I think the death of Sharon would have about as much effect on us as the death of the Emir of Dubai.
Really? Even despite everything that Mr. Sharon was thought to have been responsible for in Lebanon when Israel invaded back in 1982?
Well, yes, I think there are some people who are, to use the word, petty-minded enough to actually rejoice that he's dead, but you know, if you regard him as being a mass murderer, then you should say, okay, he's gone to meet his maker, and he will be meted out with the appropriate justice there. There's no reason to even, bother to open your window and yell Yahoo at the world. Some will do this.
So, Walid, what do you think? Sorry to interrupt you, but let's just clarify this. What do you think was the effect of Mr. Sharon's role in Lebanon over all these years while the Israeli army was present in your country? Mr. Sharon was Defense Minister of Israel at the time of the invasion in 1982, very closely identified with that whole operation. What are your thoughts about that?
He was in charge. I mean, even if somebody else was doing the shooting, he was the one giving the orders. And for those who were on the receiving end of that, of which I personally was not, but I can definitely sympathize more with my neighbors than with somebody across the ocean, this was, an atrocious episode in our history where we are being, pummeled by a very strong army. And
Walid, if I can interrupt you
Professor Steinberg just wants a word. Yeah, just 1 second. Just a second. Let's hear from Professor Steinberg.
If we go back and we understand Sharon's view of the world, his strategy, he grew up in the 1950s in the Israeli army. There were terrorist raids then. That was before any occupied territories. The Palestinian, the PLO movement, Mr. Arafat grew up in the mid-60s. They had established a base in the West Bank. Then they killed a lot of Israelis, and they were forced to leave after they tried to destroy the Jordanian government. Then they went over to, basically they moved to Lebanon and took over southern Lebanon and launched terror attacks against Israel. Mr. Sharon certainly overreached then, but the strategic logic that he employed then was to try to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he focused very strongly on the PLO presence in Lebanon. It was a failure. It was a catastrophe. I think he recognized it. Israeli recognized it. We all recognized it. I think Sharon's genius was that he understood the mistakes. When he had a second opportunity, he did not repeat them. He clearly learned from those errors in all respects.
Walid, what do you make of that?
No comment.
You still there, Walid?
I agree.
Yeah, no? All right, okay. Thanks very much for the call, Walid. Walid Nasrallah there in Beirut in Lebanon. I'll read you a couple more emails. Jug Mahan in Canada writes in to say Sharon's life is a mere blip on history's radar. Applaud his good deeds and condemn the bad. Harun Khan in New Delhi in India says, I still have a very strong feeling that Sharon will be back at the helm soon. He's a very strong man, the most important figure in the Middle East peace process. We've had an SMS text message from Majid Habib in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. God has timed Ariel Sharon's removal from office perfectly. It is good for Israel as he was not heading in the right direction towards peace. And Al-Jafari Monfared in Tehran in Iran, I pray for Sharon just as I would any human who has the right to live, regardless of his religion or deeds. We'll take one more call now. Mark is in Michigan in America. Mark, do you think that if Mr. Sharon is not able to return to his job, that will have a significant impact on this country and on the region?
Oh, absolutely. His party that he founded was solely based on him and his personality, so I really don't know where that leaves him. I've seen some polls, Israeli polls, saying that the party would still do fairly well, but I think his party really is the whole personality and the identity of the party was Mr. Sharon himself.
All right, Mark, thanks very much indeed. Just a reminder at this point, this is Have Your Say. We're live on BBC television and radio. I'm Robin Lustig in Jerusalem. You can watch this programme, by the way, at any time on our website at bbcnews.com, Have Your Say. But you can have your say now about the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. What do you think is likely to be the impact of his illness if he's unable to return to office? Join our debate. Contact us now.
You can phone Have Your Say on 442087495353 or email us. The address is haveyoursay@bbc.co.uk. You can also send an SMS text message to 447736 100 100. All of those details and information on other ways to get in touch are on our website, bbcnews.com/haveyoursay.
Right, let's take another call from an Israeli. Anna Vida is in Haifa. Anna, do you think that if Mr. Sharon is unable to continue, that will have a significant impact on your country?
I do think very much. I would just take the opportunity to wish him good health in the situation he's in. It's very uncertain at the moment what's going to be with him, but we all know that he's most certainly not coming back running for another 4-year in government.
Have you been for many years a Sharon supporter, Anna?
No, not at all. I want to say that even if I support the person but not his policy, I found that his legacy, even with the Gaza withdrawal, is very complicated. He's got a very militaristic way of governing, being very quiet about what he actually wants to do, which was also how he started talking about the Gaza withdrawal, with saying painful concessions, but not really saying what he wanted until much later, after the election.
A lot of Israelis I've been talking to over the last few days have told me that they feel very uncertain about the future. They're not at all sure what the future holds for them. Do you feel a sense of uncertainty?
Yes, because we really don't even exactly know what this party, Kadima Party, stands for. It hasn't got a proper program. The people were not really properly elected in the right order. There are good people in the party, there are competent people in this party, but nobody really knows if this party is strong enough to stand up for elections. There are people coming together for the past few weeks, and how can you know that you're supporting something when you don't know their program and what they want to do? This is very unclear.
All right, Anna, thank you very much indeed for that. We've been talking about Mr. Sharon's record in the Gaza Strip. Last year, he ordered settlers and soldiers to leave the Gaza Strip, the first time that Israel had left territory that it had occupied in 1967. So let's hear now from Gaza. Bassem Nasser is a Palestinian NGO chief. He's an expert in conflict resolution. Bassem Nasser, what are your thoughts? Do you think that life in Gaza will change in any way if Mr. Sharon is not able to resume his duties as Prime Minister of Israel?
Well, I think that the majority of Palestinians today are thinking about their own problems on the daily life. They are thinking about the coming elections on January 25th. And less Palestinians, probably more the politicians, are thinking about the health of Mr. Sharon. I think that the reports from Jerusalem declared that Mr. Sharon is not going to be back to office anyway, so we are thinking about the era after Sharon.
All right, Bassem, thank you very much for that. Let's talk also to a Palestinian head teacher in Gaza, Ahmed Abdullah, who joins us from there. Ahmed, you deal with young people in Gaza. They have lived through many, many years of violence. Some Palestinians I know blame Mr. Sharon and his colleagues for that. Just tell us a little bit about what you feel life in Gaza has been like for young Gazans over recent years.
Actually, it is not the time to talk about militias, and this is God will. But most of our children have a bad memory about this man, and we consider him as a shedder of blood. And our children, our students, never lived their childhood as any other children in the whole world. They lived all the time on little, and they never feel security, even at home, on the way to school, even at school. And this was because of the wrong policy of the Israeli occupation for the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Actually, we are looking forward for a new future. And we hope that by the end of this man, we can see a new life for the Palestinians, especially we are coming to general election in Palestine and Israel. We hope this election bring to the power people who strongly believe in peace and try all their best to find a solution for this problem, which lasted for more than 60 years.
All right, Ahmed Abdullah, thank you for that. Our third caller from Gaza, who I think we can go to now, is Jamal Al-Seki, who's a doctor in Gaza. Dr. Al-Seki, if you can hear me, if indeed it's right that Mr. Sharon will not return as Israeli Prime Minister, how will you remember him, and how will you remember the part that he's played both in Israeli politics and indeed in the life of many Palestinians over recent years?
Thank you. We have more than one reason to remember Mr. Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel. The first reason is that he has a very black and dim past against Palestinians, because no one will forget his crimes and his massacres against the Palestinians in Lebanon or in occupied territories. We will not forget that he is the man who was responsible for the second Intifada, Al-Aqsa in uprising, by entering Al-Aqsa Mosque. No one will forget him that he is responsible for the crimes from Rafah to Jenin. He's responsible for the killing of more than 4,000 of martyrs, and more than 45,000 of people were injured. Many of them were handicapped and still handicapped. No one will forget
all
that.
Right, just 1 second. Dr. Al-Seki, stop there 1 second, because Professor Steinberg wants to comment on what you've just said.
It's quite clear that you have a long list of complaints and are very angry about the history of the conflict. What Mr. Sharon understood, and I think the vast majority of Israelis understood, was that this will not change for many, many years. Israelis have also suffered. We have a very different version of history. We think Mr. Arafat actually got Mr. Sharon elected because of the violence, the terrorism, what you call the second Intifada. Now, the question is whether Mr. Sharon, by taking Israeli troops and Israeli presence out of Gaza, has given Palestinians a chance to stop being victims and to create their own lives, to go on with elections and to meet Israel on an equal basis, not as victims, not as terrorists, not as martyrs. Mr. Sharon did something that, and with the support of the Israeli public, that's very important, this wasn't Sharon on his own, that changed the map of the conflict. This is an opportunity. Israelis are waiting to see whether you and your colleagues will grasp this opportunity and go forward and say this era of victimization and all these claims that have been made, that has to end, because Israelis have a long list as well.
Okay, let's just go back to Dr. Al-Seki then. There you have it. I mean, you're living in Gaza, the Israeli army has gone, the settlers have gone. That was a decision made by a government led by Ariel Sharon. Has that not made life any better for you and your fellow Gazans?
Yeah.
Can I
Dr. Al-Seki, yeah, go ahead. Oh, you can't hear us. All right, apologies for that. Well, Jamal al-Seki, thanks very much indeed for that. Let's take another call now. Syed Abbas joins us from Oxford in England. Syed, you're from Pakistan, is that right?
I am.
Hello, Syed, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, OK, go ahead. Tell us your thoughts about Ariel Sharon.
Well, I see it in a broader Muslim perspective. There's been a growing fear in the last 10 years that there's an alliance between the Christian right, the Jewish right, and the Hindu right that's very anti-Muslim, and that's grown in strength over the last few years. And the reason why many Muslims have supported this violent method of resistance against Israel and other occupying force is partly out of this sense of fear of persecution from this very strong alliance. Ariel Sharon sat at the very heart of this alliance, and given his own war crimes record, he could never be seen as a man of peace by the Muslims.
What do you mean war crimes record?
In Lebanon, and the crimes that he committed also in Jenin.
I think we do have to be honest here.
Just a second, Syed. Professor Steinberg's going to come back.
We have to be honest here. There's been a long history of warfare. And the people who killed Palestinians in Lebanon were Christians. Now, Mr. Sharon was investigated. There was an Israeli judicial investigation, very detailed, very careful. And Mr. Sharon, as the minister who was responsible for the overall plan but had nothing to do with the killings, was in fact reprimanded. I think it's important to also credit the Israeli political system and the judicial system, and Mr. Sharon himself for having learned the lessons. But this was in a war. There were terrorism, there were people being killed, there were wars from Egypt and Syria throughout this period. We certainly can't rewrite history and use terms like war criminals like this haphazardly. That's not going to help us.
All right, Syed, let me ask you this then, looking forward rather than backwards. Do you think that if Mr. Sharon does not return to power, that will have an impact on the likely future development of relations between Israelis and Palestinians and between Israel and the Muslim world more generally?
Well, I think, in response to Professor Steinberg, is that Israeli public must throw up a kind of face of leadership which can have a better chance of winning the Palestinian heart. You need to do better than Sharon or Netanyahu as the best, possible, leadership that can be thrown up to improve the prospects of peace. So I am hoping that the Israeli public will seize the opportunity to perhaps strengthen the liberal left in Israel, the Labour Party under Amir Peretz, for example, who has an ethnic Arab background, has probably more of a likelihood of being seen as a more acceptable face by the Muslims. Think of this. I, as a Muslim, given the facts that Professor Steinberg has quoted, could not see Sharon as a man of peace or a man who could deliver peace simply because of the impression that he creates because of what his perception is. So there's a perception problem.
All right, so let me stop. Sorry to interrupt you, but let me stop you there because I want to hear what Professor Steinberg thinks about the likely future of Israeli politics in a moment. Just a couple of quick emails though. George Hinton in Twickenham in South London in England says the sidelining of Ariel Sharon will possibly help the extremists in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, as the new Kadima party, that's the party that Mr. Sharon founded just a matter of weeks ago, was formed around Sharon and his search for a resolution to the Palestinian question. And Lars Nilsson in Stockholm in Sweden says Netanyahu's rise to power, the new leader of the Likud party, which Mr. Sharon left, would see Gaza back under Israeli control and an aggressive settlement expansion policy both in Gaza and the West Bank. It would be a disaster. Now, Professor Steinberg, you have Syed saying he hopes that the liberal left might be strengthened if Ariel Sharon does not return to power. You have others saying they fear or they think that the right will be strengthened. What do you think?
I think it does not very much depend on what Israel does or what the Israeli voters see, but in fact, what Palestinians do, what Egyptians do, Jordanians, Syrians, and what the wider world does, including Iran. Israelis tend to respond. We are still roughly 6 million Jews in Israel, much wider hostile Muslim region. We've got a peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan, but it's moving very slowly. It's a cold peace. We need to see, Israelis need to see, I think across the board, there is not that much difference between left and right. What Kadima is about, what Sharon understood and in some ways helped to mold, but also responding from the bottom up, from the Israeli public demand, was a pragmatic policy. If there is an opening on the other side, from the Palestinians, from the Muslim world, from the Arab world, if the Iranian rhetoric of genocide can somehow be halted and the nuclear weapons program doesn't reach its objectives, then Israel will respond in kind. But if not, Israel will also take the actions it needs to defend itself as it has. That Kadima is a very pragmatic party, and that's why it is likely to survive much weaker until it finds a leader and a charismatic focus. But that is why Kadima had such wide support, not because of Sharon's personality, but because of that core idea.
Just one quick question on what Lars said in that email from Stockholm. He said that if Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud were returned to power, Israel would go back into Gaza. Do you think that's likely?
There's a lot of ignorance and a lot of fantasy about Israel. Mr. Netanyahu, we don't know what he would do if he was elected prime minister again, but my guess is he would do more or less what Mr. Sharon did and would have done, and might still do if he recovers. Pragmatic-based policies. Yes, politicians have different forms of rhetoric, and there is always going to be a debate. But when push comes to shove, the Prime Minister of Israel, in the government of Israel, with all of the advisory process that exists, will take pragmatic steps. Going back into Gaza is just not one of those.
Okay, let's take another call now. Joy is on the line from Cheshire in England. Joy, how much difference do you think it's likely to make if Mr. Sharon does not return to power?
Well, I don't think it'll make a huge difference, because I'm hoping that the people who follow him will follow in his footsteps, and as a tribute to him, will continue in some of the very brave things he was doing. I've just been so shocked at what I've been hearing people say, and the misinformation and the half-truths, calling him a war criminal, trying to say that he was responsible for Jenin, when in fact all they were trying to do was to root out the terrorists from the camps and stop the bomb factories. I think he was a man who was able to change. He turned out to be a very positive leader. He made many brave decisions. He surprised people by acting entirely contrary to the expectations of many. And I just think it's a tragedy of timing that just at the time when it looked as if he may be able to pull a lot of people together to continue to move forward towards peace, that we possibly have lost him from the political arena. I hope not from the whole arena. But when you hear some of the Palestinian callers and you hear the misinformation and you hear all the negative things that they're saying, it just makes you so pessimistic about peace. Sharon wanted peace. He wanted a partner for peace. He strived all the time to find it. He never found the right people to talk to. Even now, Abbas is saying all the wrong things about negative things and not really wanting to make peace. The Palestinians have been celebrating at his illness, which I find absolutely tragic. I think anybody with an ounce of humanitarian sense would not be doing that. And they've threatened, if he dies, that they will launch rockets on Israel. That, to me, does not have any possibility for peace in the future. And Sharon was really, really striving to take us there. And I, for one, although I hope that it will continue, because I hope Kadima does move forward, and I hope whoever is his successor, as a tribute to him, will actually follow in his footsteps, because he moved Israel so far on and was trying for peace. We've got to find a partner. The Palestinians have to realize it's in their best interest, as well as in Israel's, to actually look at each other and say living together is not impossible. Let's really get round the table and talk again.
All right, Joy, thanks very much indeed for that. Just a quick reminder that you're listening to Have Your Say. We're live on BBC Television and radio. I'm Robin Nozick in Jerusalem. You can watch this programme, by the way, at any time on our website at bbcnews.com, Have Your Say. You can have your say now about the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, what you think may be the impact of his illness if he's unable to return to office. Join our debate. Contact us now.
You can phone Have Your Say on 442087495353 or email us. The address is haveyoursay@bbc.co.uk. You can also send an SMS text message to 447736 100 100. All of those details and information on other ways to get in touch are on our website, bbcnews.com/haveyoursay.
Right, a few more emails for you. Christian McAuliffe in Malta says, with Sharon out of the political stage, I feel it will be Benjamin Netanyahu and his Likud party that will benefit, especially if Netanyahu portrays himself as a moderate. Alex in Paris says, hopefully Ehud Olmert, that's the acting Prime Minister, will be able to carry on in Sharon's place. I wish him the best of luck. And Len Pannett in the UK says, this has opened the way for Netanyahu or Perez, that's Shimon Peres, the former leader of the Labour Party and ex-Prime Minister, to step back into the saddle. Either way, the peace process will be slower. Professor Gerald Steinberg here with me in the Jerusalem studio. The peace process will be slower. Some would argue there isn't much of a peace process, but moves to resolve the conflict.
First of all, the first issue that the Israeli government will have to deal with will be security. You can't talk about peace until you have security and stability. And Mr. Olmert has a handicap. He does not have a security background.
He never served in the army.
He did not become, he was not a senior officer, he wasn't a general. And Mr. Sharon certainly was. And that was part of the appeal. When Mr. Barak, also a general, chief of staff, was unable to deal with the Palestinian terrorism of the late 2000, early 2001 period, people looked to Sharon, and he had those military security credentials.
It is true, isn't it? The vast majority of Israeli prime ministers do have a background as army or general.
Because this is an area, and our country in particular has been under threat of survival since it was founded. And now we have both the problem of what to do about the rockets and terrorism coming out of Gaza, and the complete chaos, inability of the Palestinian leaders to stop that. But we also have Iran, and we have Iraq is very unstable, and who knows what Iran's going to look like in 2 or 3 years. Israelis wake up every morning concerned about security, whether it's terror alerts or whether are these other more regional threats. And so I think it's going to be difficult, not impossible. Mr. Olmert will have to bring with him people like Avi Dichter, perhaps others who have a security background. There are some discussions about Ehud Barak also joining, and the defense minister, Shaul Mofaz, is part of Kadima now. So there is a strong security background. Perhaps that's enough for Olmert.
Do you assume that Ehud Olmert, currently acting prime minister, will indeed be chosen if Mr. Sharon is going to be out of action for a considerable period of time as the new leader of Kadima and as their prime ministerial candidate?
First of all, it's very early to tell, and people are still hoping and praying that Mr. Sharon will be able to return in some capacity. But if that's not the case, because Mr. Olmert is the deputy prime minister, he's the acting prime minister, he is the central focus. And the last thing that Israelis want now is a leadership fight in the short period before the elections. Who is going to carry on Sharon's legacy? And therefore, Olmert does have that. Certainly, he has the opportunity to do that. There will be an election, and Mr. Netanyahu will lead Likud, Mr. Peretz will lead Labor. There will be other parties battling. The question is who's going to lead the coalition afterwards, and it's wide open now for all the reasons we talked about.
Okay, we'll take another Israeli caller now. Ronnie Marcus is on the line from Kfar Saba. Ronnie, do you think there is going to be a change in the likely direction that Israel takes as a result of Mr. Sharon's illness?
No. But it is very, very difficult to look at the situation, because 2.5 months in Israel, in Israeli politics, is a very, very long time. And in 2.5 months, anything can happen. But I think, looking at the other two candidates, I think people know them. And I think in the end, it'll all come back to Olmert, because he seems, I suppose he seems the safest and sanest candidate, because people know Netanyahu. The Labour leader is completely unknown and has no experience whatsoever in Israeli politics. And in a way, I don't think we'll have any alternative. And I can't see former General Chief of Staff and Prime Minister Barak coming back. It's sad to say he's had his chance, and I can't see him coming back again. So I think at the moment we're going through a very, very tough period of uncertainty here. I mean, the country will carry on, because we have to carry on. But to say I can foresee, or anybody else can foresee, what will happen in 3 or 4 or 5 months, I don't know. What I think worries people here is the daily missile attacks. What also worries them is what's happening in Palestine, or with the Palestinian leaders, and who will win the election. Because if Hamas wins the election, I think we're in a completely different ballpark then. But it's very, very
All right, Ronnie, thank you for that. Let's stop there. I want to take a call now from Egypt, the first Arab country which signed a peace agreement with Israel many years ago now. Abdul Rahman Ismail is on the line from Cairo. Abdul, what are your thoughts about the likely future of this region if indeed Mr. Sharon is not able to continue in office?
Actually, I think everything depends on the perspective of the new leader. It depends on him if he goes for peace or not. And I prefer that the new leader would go for peace, because, the region is already in tension. And what the region needs now is peace. Everything depends now on the new leader.
Do you think that Mr. Sharon, during his time in office, Prime Minister for 5 years after all, did take some steps which make it more likely that at some point in the future peace will come to this region?
Actually, the steps that Sharon has taken can be seen from different perspectives. according to us as Arabs, we think that he has made terrible things. You know, the biggest of which is triggering the Palestinian Intifada in 2001 by entering the mosque with his soldiers. But I guess recently...
Which he did not do, in fact. That is just not historically correct.
Just a minute, Abdul, Professor Steinberg wants to correct you.
I think that's a real problem because of these myths. Mr. Sharon did not go into any mosques in Jerusalem and without no security forces. If you look at the pictures, you see Mr. Sharon did what Jews have always done, which is to go to the holy places of the Jewish people. Actually, not into the mosques. And in fact, that ability to live together is exactly the problem. We just need to solve that.
Abdul?
I guess there is a big gap between the understanding of Arabs and the understanding of maybe the rest of the world concerning the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And
okay, Abdul, let's stop there. Thank you for that. That was Abdul calling from Cairo. Here's an email from London. Jeffrey Bernstein says, it would be helpful, although unlikely, if those who repeatedly attack Israel will not use this opportunity to step up their attacks on innocent civilians. Professor Steinberg, you were talking about rocket attacks which have come across the border from Gaza into Israel of late. And there does seem to be quite a widespread feeling in Israel that there's perhaps an increased risk of violence from extremists in the Palestinian community as a result of Mr. Sharon's illness.
There is a concern that the new leadership will be tested very quickly to see how it will respond, and a concern that the new leadership may feel that it has to respond very strongly. Hamas, any groups within Palestinian areas may try that scenario. I think that's particularly dangerous because it could trigger another series of events.
Even though Hamas is now participating in a Palestinian election process and seems very keen to be taken to be a player in a democratic political process.
But Hamas has not done that by giving up its arms. It is an armed faction. It is a terrorist group, and that's one of the absurdities going through elections that are supposed to be democratic. It is that we really have to look very closely at what's going on the Palestinian side. I think it's important to point out that Mr. Sharon also had a large number of opponents within Israel. And the reason that he set up a new party was that, in fact, he could not get a majority of Likud to go along with the withdrawal. And one of the reasons that the opponents, the critics, said not to pull out of Gaza is precisely what we're seeing now. Chaos, weapons flowing in from Egypt, no ability to control the border, and those missiles then coming in and striking Israeli towns and cities. That was a scenario that should have been avoided by the international community, and Sharon his critics warned him that that was going to happen. So he would not have an easy election victory even if he was healthy.
All right, let me just read you some more emails. This comes from Tejaswini Patil in Dharwad in India. Mr. Sharon's strong personality and pragmatic politics will sorely be missed in trying to unravel the complex and intricate nature of Middle East politics. We've had an SMS message from Malawi. Yusuf Mkwiche says we will pray for him only because he is human, but he is not a man of peace. Another SMS text message from Nigeria. B. Umar says Arafat has passed away. Sharon is very ill. Let the removal of these old veterans provide a new opportunity to a younger generation of leaders in the Middle East. And that's an interesting thought, Professor Steinberg, because I remember not very long ago, there were many people, both Israelis and Palestinians, who used to say it's not until both Mr. Arafat and Mr. Sharon have moved away that there is going to be a chance for peace. Very briefly.
Well, first of all, there's no comparison between the two, but more importantly than that, it's going to take fundamental changes primarily in Palestinian society. Israeli society, and what we saw under Mr. Sharon was evidence of that, has moved a long way since the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Palestinians are still stuck in 1947 rejectionism, and that's what's got to change.
Okay, there I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it. It's all we have time for. So my thanks to everybody who took part in the programme. My thanks also to my guest here, Professor Gerald Steinberg from Bar Ilan University. Don't forget, if you've still got something you would like to say about Ariel Sharon, Israel, the Middle East, the debate will continue on our website at bbnews.com/haveyoursay. It's been an interesting debate as we speak now. Ariel Sharon still lies ill in hospital here in Jerusalem. Everybody in the region still waiting to know what is likely to be the impact if he is out of action for any prolonged period of time, if indeed it does turn out that he's unable to return to office. From everybody here in Jerusalem, from the Have Your Say team, for now, from me, Robin Lustig, thank you for watching, thank you for listening. from Jerusalem, goodbye.